I'm going to show you how to create a genius. In 1965, this guy had an interesting idea. He was writing to a woman about this idea. The idea was basically this. He believed a genius is not born, but is educated and trained. And he was writing to this woman to say, hey, I want to test this theory out, but I don't have any kids of my own. And he was writing to find out if she agreed with this idea, and if so, if she would help him in proving this idea by having kids with him and creating geniuses. And she said, yeah. And so they had kids together, and they immediately started things differently. They started by homeschooling. They knew they were going to homeschool, even though it was weird and very rare in their area. They also knew that they wanted to create their children to be specifically chess geniuses. They had set out, hey, look, we could choose anything we want. Let's prove it in chess. And so they set up their home with chess books, chess boards. They played games with their kids, chess games, all the time. They had the time because they were homeschooling as well. And the result was this. Their first child, by the age of 4, was already beating adults. Their second child, by the age of 16, was a grandmaster in chess. And their last child was listed in the top 100, ranked top 100 in the world by the time she was 12. They had created a family of chess geniuses successfully. Now, interesting, you probably may or may not have heard this story, but the real question is, why hasn't everyone been taught this as a way of, hey, listen, you can actually create a genius in your own home? Think about this. When you send your kid to school, are you thinking that they're going to become a genius at school? Or are you, like very many other people, thinking genius is something that you're born with? You either have it or you don't. And when you go to school, maybe you can find out, but not necessarily expecting that school is going to turn your child into a genius. If you're thinking that school is going to turn your child into a genius, newsflash, they're not. But also at school, it's not actually necessary for your child to go to school. Now, hear me out. I understand that for some folks, they don't have the opportunity to stay at home with their children. But for those that do, school is not the best option. If you can stay at home with your kids and start them from the very beginning, educating them, you can have a much more well-rounded child, much more intelligent child, and you don't have to run the risk of them being influenced by people who don't really know what they're doing, or anyone who has malicious intent. There was a study done by, I believe his name was Ash, A-S-C-H, to test conformity. He's a psychologist, he wanted to test conformity. And so the study that he created was basically this. He got a bunch of participants, he would put them in a room with a bunch of other folks, and he would show them a line, and then he would show them 3 other lines. One of them clearly matched, one of them was clearly too long, and another line clearly too short. And he wanted to test if they would go along with what the group was thinking, if the participants would go along with what the group was saying. And so what he did was he set up the participants so that they would be the last one to answer. And so in a group of, let's say, 5 people, 4 of the people were stooges or Confederates or people in on the experiment. And they had agreed beforehand what they would answer, that they would all answer this particular line, even though it was incorrect. And the participant would be at the end watching their answers. At first, what they did was they answered correctly to gain the participants' trust. But then, at the same time, they all started answering the same incorrect answers. And what they found was that 75% of participants would conform at least once. And when asked why they would conform, some of them said they knew they were conforming, but they were afraid of conflict. They didn't want to create any conflict. Others said they doubted their own judgments. If everyone else is saying this, I must be wrong. Now think about that in the context of your children. If you put your children in an environment where everyone else is saying the same wrong thing, and especially when they're supposed to be learning, how are they supposed to know to stand up to that? How are they supposed to know that that's wrong, or to not doubt themselves, or to not just conform just because they want to avoid conflict? Now, I'm not just advocating for homeschooling. I'm saying homeschool with the right tools, or rather educate your children at home. Don't do school at home, but educate your children at home with the right tools. It's interesting because you may not have heard about this family, or you may have heard of this family, but either way, Why isn't this common practice to raise your family, raise your children to be geniuses? And to be geniuses in what? Not chess. Not because there's already geniuses in chess, but because you can raise your children to be genius in anything. And if you look out on this world and you could have a genius come here to help humanity in any way, what would you see is needed? You might see that there are people that are starving that don't need to starve. You might see that there are people who are having diseases that, quite frankly, in the first world, we don't have. You might see that there are many, many, many challenges and problems that could be solved if we had some geniuses working on them. And in fact, if we had an entire society of geniuses, we may not have the problems at all because everyone would clearly see the solution and work together. Today, it's very interesting looking at the media and what's going on in the world, but it seems like there's a lot of division. It seems like there are a lot of people who may advocate for one thing that sounds good, but then an entire group of other people who say the exact opposite. I'll give an example. Like, there are people who advocate for a universal basic income and how that would help everyone. If everyone had their basic needs met, that'd be great, right? But then there's an entire other group of people who say, well, if everyone had their basic needs met, nobody would work, right? And so there is this seeming division of even going forward with possible solutions. But if everyone was on the same page and could agree, hey, this is the best route, then we could actually start making some headway on these solutions. So how do you actually create a genius? Well, it's simple. It's very simple. If you look at some of my past videos, or you go to search for Cameron Cope on YouTube, and you look through TechnoTutor distributor or TechnoTutor co-founders' kids, you can see some kids that are verifiable geniuses. And you can also see some other kids outside of just those kids who use the same systems and the same tools to become genius. And really, it starts in the home, because by the time your kids go to school, it's already too late. They've already learned so much. They've already spent 4 years, 5 years with you at home that they've learned as much as they possibly can. If you're not taking advantage of that time, or if you're just putting them in daycare, or you're giving them to somebody else to take care of, you're not actually doing the work required to create verifiable geniuses. In fact, you're abdicating your responsibility. And the consequence will be on your children. They won't get the opportunity to become geniuses themselves. And so the best thing to do actually is starting at home, educating them from before they're even 1 year old. You're there with them, you create a stable home environment, but also you educate them, giving them the opportunity to recognize vocabulary, recognize words, recognize the letters, the symbols, all of that, so that they can start to build a structure within their mind, and they can actually communicate with you, with others, with this world in an effective way. Now, it just so happens that all these people use the same systems and technology, and we have access to that technology. Meaning, those children that I mentioned before have very effective understanding of the world, and they all use the same tools, and it is very effective at helping your kid to understand information. These parents are all using the same tools and technology to help their children in the most effective way. If you're curious about this, there's a link in the description where you can send me a message directly, where I can share with you some resources, some videos, where you can understand how this works and why it makes sense, and why you should create your child to be a genius today. Because the society that's coming is one where citizens will be limited and allowed to do only certain things, allowed to act in certain ways, and be restricted in very many other ways. What we consider our freedoms today will not be the same in the society of the future if the children who are growing up today are not aware of it. That doesn't just mean aware of what freedoms we have today, but aware of what's coming and how it's coming, and what they can do to change that. If you want your children to actually live in a free world, as opposed to living in a world that is very confined, where their freedoms are being taken away and they may or may not even be aware of it, then you have to give them the opportunity to educate themselves so they can see it in full. And unfortunately, if they're just being sent to school, or if you're expecting school to do that, it's not going to happen. But you can do it at home. And you can do it in a much better way, a much more effective way than what any child is getting in school. And your kids will have more fun. They'll appreciate you more for it. You'll appreciate the time that you spend with them. So give your kids the chance for freedom. If you want to do that, send me a message right now. Click that link in the description and say, hey Drake, I want to give my kids freedom. Or just type the word freedom. And I'll know exactly what you mean. And we can get your kids started on becoming geniuses too.